So we have these paths that we tell parents they can take, and it's not going to be the same solutions for everybody. But the overall message is to fight back against this. And whether you're going to take the route of exiting your kids from society or participating in it and teaching them, what they should be doing along the way, fighting is the message here. You have to fight back.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Today, we have a very important conversation for you with authors Bethany Mandel and Karol Markowicz about their new book, Stolen Youth. But before we start, I want to encourage everyone to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, we would love to hear from you. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most important issues we're facing today. You can find that under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. If you listen to many in the mainstream media, or figures in the Biden administration, those who express concerns about woke ideology and indoctrination in the schools are right-wing cranks, bigots, and racists. They assure us that critical race theory is not being taught in the schools, that the imposition of sexual material into the earliest grades is merely a matter of health education, and that policies aimed towards transgender transitioning, including hiding information from parents, is merely proper care for those who need it. They assert that those who are calling attention to these issues are cynical cultural warriors or trying to impose their own religious and political beliefs on others. They tell us that those who care about the way the educational establishment and their enablers is trying to turn children into leftist activists, tearing down traditional values, destroying childhood innocence, as well as helping to create an epidemic of gender dysphoria, are the ones who are for censorship and want to ban books. The truth is just the opposite. It is the woke left that is banning books and censoring opposing views. Indeed, the hallmark of their entire project, which aims at rewriting our history, smearing the traditions of Western thought, philosophy, and civilization, legitimizing racist, toxic, Marxist ideas like critical race theory and intersectionality, imposing it into school curricula, and imposing ideas about sex and gender on society, is to silence dissent. The key to this lies in intimidating and transforming children whose schools are doing all this while parents in red states as well as blue ones are largely ignorant of what is going on. And when some parents do speak up, they are immediately slapped with the racist or insurrectionist label by not just the woke left, but their allies in the Biden administration. These horrifying trends were exacerbated during the coronavirus pandemic as teachers' unions and activists shut down schools and imposed irrational mask mandates that did incalculable damage to children that will impact them for the rest of their lives. It was further made clear in the aftermath of the summer of 2020 when the Black Lives Matter riots led to a new surge of woke indoctrination on race aimed at destroying our belief in the goal of equality and substituting for it the new DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion catechism that views a colorblind society and equal opportunity as not so much unattainable goals as it is undesirable. While telling us that the right is authoritarian, that is imposing a new totalitarianism on not just academia, the press, and pop culture, it is the left that is doing so. How can parents fight back against this terrible problem? The answer starts with information. We need to learn what is actually happening in the schools and in institutions that impact children. and then we have to learn to fight back. Two brave journalists, who are themselves both mothers, have stepped forward to provide some answers. Bethany Mandel and Karol Markowicz have written a vitally important new book, Stolen Youth: How Radicals Are Erasing Innocence and Indoctrinating a Generation. Bethany Mandel is a contributing writer for Deseret News, an editor of the children's book series Heroes of Liberty, a columnist for Fox News, and a homeschooling mother of 6 who lives in Maryland with her husband and children. Karol Markowicz is a weekly columnist at the New York Post and Fox News, contributing editor at The Spectator, and a contributing writer to the Washington Examiner magazine. She was born in the Soviet Union and grew up in Brooklyn. She lives in South Florida with her husband and 3 children. Bethany Mandel and Karol Markowicz, welcome to Top Story.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Oh, thank you both for coming on. It's really a pleasure to see both of you and to have you on to talking about this really important book. I want to compliment you both on writing it, and I want to start by asking each of you, both busy writers as well as mothers, what convinced you that this was a book that needed to be written?
I'll let Bethany start.
Yeah, so Karol and I have been thinking for literally years about writing a book together because our coverage areas aligned so closely. She mostly would beat me to the punch with anything I ever wanted to write, and then I would read it and be like, dang, she wrote it better than I would have. That's a really good angle. And we sort of aligned so nicely, but also got along so well. And so we were always kind of thinking about, what would we write together? What would our possible topic area be? And then we sort of watched COVID unfold, and her and I were beating the same bully pulpit. The kids were coming last, and that they were being victimized by our public health response to COVID. And so we said, we think this is part of a larger sort of attack on children and childhood that's coming from the woke progressive left. But is there enough there for a book? And so we opened a Google document and we just started throwing stories in of things that we saw. And within 3 or 4 days, our perspective changed from, do we think we have enough, to how could we possibly write something with this volume of material that we have? How can we categorize it? How can we wrap our brains around this phenomenon, which is so much more widespread than I think that we realized until we sat down and, put it into an Excel spreadsheet and said, in this area, and this area, and this area. And then we just decided, we should figure out the categories and just start writing. And that's basically what we did. But it was a daunting project when we first started out, because we had seen sort of the individual picture, but then when we zoomed out and looked at it from a big picture level, we realized, wow, this is part of a massive sort of movement that is trying to indoctrinate children to become basically child soldiers in their revolution to remake American society, Western civilization, you name it.
Yeah. Well, I'll just stop right there before I get to you, Karol. Let me, Bethany, at the beginning of the pandemic, you were accused of being a grandma killer because you thought that, children should be prioritized and, zoos should be open. So many of your concerns were obviously correct and were, prescient as far as what were the real dangers. But I guess this question will start with is, and I know in part because at the beginning of the pandemic, I was worried, and I think other people were, that, the elderly would be sacrificed. Indeed, I wrote about that, but that turned out to be completely, a righteous thought, the opposite of what was happening. It was children who were going to be sacrificed. Why, in a society that is supposed to prize children and to, regard them as the future, why did children come last during the pandemic? And how did that sort of aid this, woke revolution that you've just quickly described?
Yeah, so I think that kids came last because a lot of people who were in positions of power did not have children themselves and did not care about children, only insofar as they deemed them useful. They were happy to use the less than 1% of children who were at risk, kids with congenital heart malformations, whatever, to make the case that all the schools should be closed and every kid should be masked indefinitely forever. I mean, my kids still go to the pediatrician in a mask. This is never ending for some people. But they, I think, decided to make children the bottom of the priority list because they had to feel like they were doing something. But the adults still wanted to go to bars. The adults still wanted to go to the Knicks games. But kids don't vote. And so when you wanted to feel like you could do something, who could you inflict the something on? It's the compliant 5-year-old who doesn't know how to say to an adult, I really don't think that a cloth mask on me while I'm touching my face and snotting all over is effective. They don't have, I mean, my 5-year-old says that because he lives in my house, but a normal 5-year-old isn't capable of standing up for themselves and applying critical thinking skills. I mean, God, we don't have adults who are capable of applying critical thinking skills. I still see people driving alone in their cars wearing cloth masks in almost the spring of 2023. So, you have a society that is willing to put this on children because they wanted to do it. They wanted to do something. And so it was really depressing to see school closures in blue areas seep well into 2021 while the rest of us were back to normal. It was an incredibly disturbing phenomenon to watch as an adult who had a troubled childhood, but who turned out okay, because I would not have turned out okay if I were a child now. And we're seeing the ramifications of what we did to kids in test scores and mental health studies, everything. And we argue in the book, and I think we argue it effectively, that that's the point. They don't want children at the end of this who are happy and secure, and because that's not how you gain compliance. You can only convince people to join your revolution when they are discontented. And they are raising a generation of children who are miserable and anxious and depressed.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And as politics played into it, the masks became the MAGA cap of Team Blue. But Karol, you wrote movingly in this book of the parallels between the totalitarianism of the former Soviet Union that your family escaped and what is going on in contemporary America in education and culture. Critics would claim that that's an extreme analogy, but explain to us how it applies, especially with the parallels to Stalinism and its child martyr, Pavlik Morozov.
Right. So it's interesting because I think for most of my life, I would have said that the parallel of the United States and the Soviet Union would be extreme. And throughout my life, people have asked me like, oh, doesn't this seem like Soviet to you? And I'd say, no, it really doesn't actually. But for the last few years, I would say for the last decade, but really in the last 3 to 5 years, what has happened is the cultural part of those totalitarian societies has arrived at our shores. So yes, you won't be arrested for speaking out or saying the wrong thing, but you will be targeted by your neighbors. You might be targeted by friends. You could have somebody call your job, as has happened to plenty of people. Jennifer Say got fired from Levi's for pushing for schools to reopen during COVID, which was clearly the right position. But because it wasn't the right position, she got fired. And so we see this happening throughout our society, and the pressure that is placed on people to conform and to say things in a really specific way is very similar to totalitarian societies where only one opinion is allowed. And not only must you voice that one opinion, you must make a big show of voicing that opinion. It's not enough to say that I'm not racist. You have to say I'm anti-racist. You have to put a BLM sign in your window. It has to be a spectacle, and that's what's expected of you. So what you had, for example, over the last few years was people got in trouble not just for saying the wrong thing, but not saying the right thing strongly enough. I remember an article about couples breaking up over Trump. And in some of the cases, the person wasn't even pro-Trump. They just weren't anti-Trump enough. And that's really a very similar string to what happens in totalitarian societies, in the way that you're forced to parrot certain things and parrot them correctly.
Yeah, I mean, I really love the Stalinist parallel, of Pavlik Morozov, because this was a famous example of a child who turns in his parents, for being anti-Stalinist or not being sufficiently pro-Stalinist.
Yeah.
That really plays out in America today too, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And you know what's interesting about the Pavlik story is I asked my mom about it, and she didn't know even now that a lot of that story was a lie, that it was just a propaganda tale, because it was so ingrained in her childhood, where the story is that Pavlik's parents were hoarding grain, so he turned them into the authorities and became this hero. That never happened. The parents had no relation to hoarding grain, and none of this was real. But Russians, or ex-Soviets in general, grew up with this Pavlik story being a real, telling tale of what happens. And now we have the Pavlik example in so many different ways. Like Greta is the child, that is emulated now, and she also talks about how the adults, how damaging they are to her mission.
Greta, the environmental extremist from Sweden. Greta
That's
Thunberg.
Right. Yes. So she's the, sort of the Pavlik of our time, where she's deified, and her word is taken as some sort of, just law. And there's so many other examples in the book of children being used for this kind of activism and being held up as this martyrs to their causes.
Yeah. How did the pandemic impact this struggle? And why is it so important to understand the damage that was done? And why can't it be simply forgotten in the post-pandemic amnesty that a lot of people are calling for today?
Well, for one thing, I would say that if you liked COVID-19, you're going to like COVID-29 and COVID-32 and COVID-35 even more, because they've learned some important lessons about how easy it is to get us to conform. And that conformity is a big part of what we write about in the book, because the COVID moment clashed with cancel culture. So it became, you must believe what we all believe, even if it's clear to you that this doesn't work. I mean, the cloth mask thing is a great example, because I think people realized really early that little piece of cloth could not possibly have any connection to keeping us safe. And yet they wore it, and they wore it so long and so steadily that maybe they came to believe, maybe they didn't, but you were only allowed to say masked, you must mask, and if you don't, then you don't belong with our in-group. And that kind of conformist thinking, it is a negative for us all, but it's a negative for children specifically, not just because they were targeted, but because it really doesn't teach them to be confident in their free opinions. And if we're not free, what's the point of any of this? What's the point of raising our children to not be free and to not say what they actually believe, and to, have the emperor's new clothes example of just saying what you think you're supposed to say? I don't want to raise my kids like that. And I don't think a lot of Americans do either.
No. Bethany, you had, your own struggles where you live about masks, and that really informed, how bureaucracies and just have impact on our lives that we don't even know about, and went along doing things for no scientific reason, for no logical reason.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories is my daughter was playing soccer in the summer of 2021, and she was the only kid on her team not wearing a cloth mask outside in the summer of 2021.
In the fresh air.
In the summer of 2021. And the kids around her asked, well, where's your mask? And it was such a pressure to conform, and it really... it left an impact on her, seeing other children of her generation, because she didn't want to be part of them anymore. She didn't want to be part of that. I was filling out her summer camp application a couple days ago, and on the summer camp application, it said, how has the last 2 years impacted your child? Because a lot of kids who are coming through, in the last year, we've noticed are really struggling with the aftermath of the pandemic and our response to it. And I wrote on the application, she's developed a healthy mistrust of authority. And that's exactly what it is. And, the majority of kids did not develop that healthy mistrust, and they should have.
No, they've just, they've absorbed the addiction to COVID fear of their elders. Bethany, you've also you wrote in the book about how children's books have become a woke fiefdom. How does this work, and what does it mean in terms of how libraries operate?
Yeah, so I was actually just writing a column about that because it's in the news again with the Roald Dahl news. So it's a nice sort of case study into how this happens. So Roald Dahl is amusing and entertaining because he's not politically correct. He talks about fat women. He talks about the Oompa Loompas as, his style of writing pushes the envelope that we currently have today, though I don't even think it does. But the publishing company has decided to alter his work because he is using this language and they've gotten the permission of his estate. So they are putting new editions into print that have been rewritten by sensitivity readers. So basically everyone should go to and only buy used editions of Roald Dahl. But in the future, what this does for future writers is they can't get anything past their agent. They can't get anything to publishing companies, and they can't get anything past the sensitivity readers. They will have such a sanitized version of stories by the time they hit published that they're not entertaining anymore. And this is a phenomenon that's happening in publishing, in not just the news media, but also in books and movies. If you watch old episodes of Seinfeld and Friends, they would never air now because they're too controversial. This is not just an attack on Roald Dahl. It's sending a message to any author that you cannot use the word fat. You cannot write that a woman is a secretary. You can't describe someone as short, old people, like you name it. Any sort of perceived description that is unpleasant in any way is sanitized. And it's straight out of George Orwell, honestly.
Yeah, Karol, who is really doing the censoring right now? We hear a lot about that right-wingers are banning books. Is that really what's going on?
So I'm in Florida, which keeps being pointed to as book banning capital. And I know that the books being taken out of school libraries are pornographic. They're not insulting somebody. They're not making fun of anybody. They're none of that. It is literally pornographic pictures that you wouldn't be able to show on the news are being allowed into the kids' libraries. So it's wild to me that people think that it's the right censoring things. I mean, other than pornographic materials, nothing is being censored. And in fact, what actually is being censored is things like the Roald Dahl and, the Dr. Seuss, which we talk about in the book. And this kind of rewrite of history should concern people. Again, going back to that totalitarian example, we've had this happen in history where we remove references that no longer suit us. And that is really not truthful. And it's not the way that we should proceed. And we should take the example of countries that have had this kind of thing happen before. It's really crazy that it's happening in America and that there isn't more outrage about it. It should not be only outrage on the right. The left should be outraged here too. This is a deletion of actual history, and they're letting it happen. They're promoting it to happen. I want to also just add that leftism in general is very unpopular. This kind of thing is just leftism. I know it sounds like it seems like it should be overwhelmingly popular, but it's not. Only like 7% of the country describe themselves as very liberal. And that number might even be lower if you talk about progressives or words like that. But they get what they want through being loud and through force. And the fact that the 93% who are not very liberal are not stopping them is emboldening them and letting them proceed and gain power and keep pushing through their terrible ideas. We have to stop them and we have to fight.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And, I think people talk about censoring, as you say, these pornographic books in children's libraries, but, they've been taking, it's the left that has been taking, traditional, classics like Huckleberry Finn and even To Kill a Mockingbird, the ultimate liberal book, out of libraries because it's not up to date with today's politically correct ideas.
Yeah, there's a lot of self-censorship happening here as well. The books aren't even necessarily getting to editors because agents are telling writers, I'm not going to be able to get this. I don't want to waste my limited capital with this editor putting forth a proposal that will not get approved. And the editors are terrified of corporate. If they come down and say, this isn't exactly, you can't have a white woman writing about an experience of a Black girl in the South in the 1920s. Only people with lived experience can write about this. But there's no one currently writing who can write about the lived experience of a Black girl in the 1920s in the South. So on every level, people are self-censoring, but also sort of the role of a sensitivity reader is to imagine what outrage could this spark. And so they're deleting entire characters, entire lines. And so on every level, the author is self-censoring because they know their agent won't like it. The agent is censoring because they think that the editor won't like it. The editor is censoring because they don't think corporate will like it. And then corporate is employing sensitivity readers because they're afraid of getting canceled by the mob. And so with every sort of line that you're moving up, more and more of the essence of the story is stripped away until you're finally left with something that's so sanitized, it's unpalatable.
Yeah. Let's transition to another, related topic. Bethany, what was the dust up over Disney and Ron DeSantis really about? Why was it so important for the left to label Florida's law about keeping sex and gender indoctrination out of the lower grades as don't say gay? How did that happen? How did that become the way that law was referred to in the media?
So, the reality of the law is you can't teach sexuality to children in kindergarten through third grade. I would argue it didn't go far enough. That if I'm going to complain about that law, it's that it didn't go far enough. But the left decided, and they're very good at this, they completely messaged the bill incorrectly in order to drum up outrage. And do I think that, so Disney sort of took aim at Ron DeSantis because they're used to Republicans who, when faced with a challenge coming from a company as large and as powerful as Disney, it is very powerful in Florida, that they'll roll over. And Ron DeSantis said, no, I'm not only not rolling over, but I'm going to turn the gun on you. And that was incredibly powerful because folks went into that dust up between Disney and Ron DeSantis and said, how can Ron DeSantis stand up to Disney? They are so powerful. And DeSantis said, we are really nice to y'all. We give you a lot of tax breaks, a lot of kickbacks. I don't think you need them anymore. And I know that you can't pick up this park that's in Orlando and move it literally anywhere else in the country. So if you want to tango, let's tango. And I think that was the right move. And he didn't let the left define that bill. He pushed back, and he pushed back hard. And I think that DeSantis has all of the positive aspects of Donald Trump without so many negatives, without the fear that he's going to start a world war on Twitter, for example.
Yeah. Karol, you've done a lot of reporting on this controversy as well. The framing of it is so important. And, you know, sort of it's become like a dividing line in our culture, hasn't it?
So it's interesting. What Bethany said was what I hear from Floridians is like, why only till third grade? Why not all of elementary school? Because I have a fourth grader. I mean, why, you know, I don't want him learning about gender ideology in school either. And, you know, so far in Florida, he hasn't. But the labeling of that bill was so important to the left, because any parent that hears that the bill makes sure that gender ideology is not taught to K through third graders is like, yeah, why would they be taught gender ideology? So you had to make it, the left had to make it a don't say gay bill to make it more offensive to people, even though that was not what was in it. If they had to frame it that way, because otherwise the overwhelming majority of parents agree with that sentiment of not teaching gender ideology to their children. It's been amazing to watch, and Bethany's right. It's been really awesome to watch a politician, a Republican politician, not back down and actually stand up for their values and stand up for sanity, where all parents would agree with him, and he knows he has that support.
Yeah, I think this speaks to a lot. I mean, this runs throughout your book about how sort of the educational establishment has been taken over by the left. But let's move to the transgender issue. The movement, you know, on behalf of, that claims to be acting on behalf of transgender children, claims that questions about what is doing, you know, are just rooted in bigotry. But what really happened to create this dysphoria epidemic, and why is it not okay to notice that?
So I wrote the transgender chapter, and I've been covering sort of transgender issues with children for a while. Abigail Schreier wrote a groundbreaking book about it that is now obsolete because things have moved so quickly and so radically. And the title of her book is Irreversible Damage. And it is truly perfectly titled. These medical sort of professionals are committing irreparable and irreversible damage on mostly young girls. And a lot of it is a social contagion. One of the most powerful stories that I heard, that I wrote in our introduction, was from a mother who, her daughter experienced a mental health crisis because of the lockdowns during COVID-19. And her daughter became suicidal. And they immediately decided, for the safety of this child, we need to put her in an inpatient facility as fast as possible. They could only find one that would accept an inpatient because of COVID. All the other facilities had really long waiting lists. And so they dropped her off masked and said, you can't see her again except on Zoom. And so this facility had total control over this child who was at a really vulnerable place in her mental health. And almost every single child in that facility magically decided that the genesis of their issues was not that they were bipolar or had clinical depression, but that they were the wrong gender and that they had gender dysphoria. And so almost every single child in this program decided they were non-binary or they were transgender. And this girl came out to her parents over Zoom masked. So imagine this picture. They send her there, she's suicidal, and then 2 weeks later, drugged out of her mind, she shows up, and it's like a hostage video. She's masked, they can't see her face, and the therapist sitting next to her is pressuring her. What did you want to say? What did you want to say? And it's as if she had a script right next to her. This is what you tell your parents. And so her parents pulled her out of this program, but she came out convinced that she was non-binary. She put her daughter back into school, which was then meeting in person. And instead of the school working with her on her child's mental health issues, they instead affirmed her non-binary self-identification. And now it wasn't just this facility that was working against her, but the school as well. And so this is sort of the gender ideology movement is a unique moment. You know, I've heard from a lot of people who are very jaded and said, you know, you've always said that they're coming for the children, but this is different because it's not just a political movement coming for our children, but every aspect of our society that is affirming that attack. The schools are affirming it. Entertainment is affirming it. Publishing is affirming it. And so from every corner, children are fed gender ideology, and it's confusing. And it's part of a larger sort of movement, I think, to make them discontented and susceptible to becoming revolutionaries.
I would just add that we have spent the last few years checking our privilege. And for a lot of these kids, when they check their privilege, they realize, oh, they're pretty privileged. And they don't have, let's say they're a white child who grew up in the suburbs. They don't have anything to mark them as oppressed. Well, suddenly they can make a really easy argument for why they're oppressed. Here I am, I'm non-binary now. And that means I'm oppressed. And that means that you're the oppressor. And that means that I have control.
Yeah, I think everybody wants to be a victim in contemporary society. Is it? I mean, it's not as simple as that, but this sort of epidemic, this enormous increase in people children claiming to have gender dysphoria. I mean, it's got to come from someplace.
Yeah, and it's not just coming from someplace; it's coming from everywhere. One of the parents who I spoke with said that out of her daughter's Girl Scout troop, 8 girls came out as either non-binary or transgender in the same year. And a lot of those transformations happened after health class that told them, this is the gingerbread person, and this is how you can decide to, even though your genitalia is one thing, your head can be something else, and you can have a different brain. It's really ironic coming from the folks who have the sign on their front lawn, in this house we believe in science, but they don't believe in the science of anatomy, of biology, of DNA, none of it. All of that goes out the window because my heart feels a certain way, and therefore every aspect of that person's sex goes out the window and instead is replaced by a different gender.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great irony here also that there's no greater sin than to sort of be appropriate another culture and claim to be a different race. That's the worst thing. Race is supposed to be, that's at the heart of critical race theory. Race is sort of the defining instance. You can't change it, but you can change race is actually very superficial in terms of our humanity, but gender is biology, and that can be switched, at the drop of a hat.
And it's so funny, the TikTok and the YouTube personalities who are transgender, who say that they are women, trot out the worst stereotypes about women. Dylan Mulvaney, I don't remember what his transgender name is, but his real name is Dylan Mulvaney. He pretends to be a woman on TikTok and on social media. And his first video about his first day as a woman, I wrote a very heated email, but then I didn't send it. I cried. And it was so deeply insulting as a woman that this is what he thinks that being a woman is. Dancing around in heels, crying at the drop of a hat, and writing impassioned emails that you don't send. This personification of women as emotional and not just irresponsible, but also irrational. This is what they're projecting as this is the female experience. And in a normal world, the J.K. Rowlings who say like this is actually really misogynistic would be listened to, but instead, J.K. Rowling is public enemy number one.
Right. Is it a choice between traditional values and sexualizing children? Why are, I guess, Karol, I'll put this to you, why are parents and society in general passively accepting this, or many are? That's become normal. And anybody who speaks up is an insurrectionist, as we saw when the Attorney General Garland accepted the lead from the National School Board Association.
So I think that that's exactly it. I think that they're afraid. They're afraid of being labeled. They're afraid of being on the wrong side. They worked so hard to be in their tribe, and now they don't want to be cast out. And the thing is that they've watched people get cast out for less.
Yes.
They saw people be targeted and really throttled over the last few years for really benign opinions. So they're not going to take the chance of saying that, like, oh, this pornographic book in my kid's library shouldn't exist. They might protect their own child from it, but they're not going to raise a fuss about it. And so what ends up happening there is that you have a really fearful society where people are afraid to say what they really think. All of that is related to these issues. It's because these people are so afraid to be targeted and they're being shut down and they're forced to conform. And that's why the left is getting to run rampant on all of these different issues. The thing that we wanted to convey with the book is that we have a lot of books about how colleges create woke children. But the thing is, it's happening way before colleges now. And it's not just schools. It is schools, but it's also publishing houses. It's also pediatricians. It's also teaching colleges. It's also medical schools. It's also all of it. And all of it is aimed at one direction, and they're heading right for your kids. And we're not saying that to scare you. We're saying that to wake people up.
Yeah. And the lesson of COVID for a lot of these folks was that they could force conformity and silence with just outrage. And so if anyone dared to question why is the soccer league requiring masks outside in 2021, which they did until I emailed and said, I will not mask and I will rescind our registration if this is the policy. My daughter was the only child on the team who got a follow-up email that said, oh, JK, this isn't actually our policy. You don't have to wear a mask. No one else questioned the league director. And so everyone else just wore a mask because they didn't want to be seen as a grandma killer. They didn't want to be seen as a mask denier. What was the epithet thrown at people who anti-masker? That's it. No one wanted to be an anti-masker. And, I'm a flamethrower by profession. And so I'm not afraid to say, yeah, I'm an anti-masker. I don't think a cloth mask on my 8-year-old running around outside does anything. No one else was brave enough to make that stand. But even me, a professional flamethrower, I just wrote an email to my kid's pediatrician 2 days ago asking for them to drop the mask mandate. And I was debating with my friend for days. Like, I don't want to ruin this relationship. I don't know if they know who I am. I don't want them to Google my name. And I was nervous, Bethany Mandel in 2023, to send a really calmly worded email saying, my younger kids are afraid to go to the doctor, and it's because faceless people come at them with instruments and needles. They have not formed emotional connection with any of their medical providers, not the nurses, not the doctors, nothing. And it used to be in the healthcare profession, in pediatricians' offices especially, that they had that relationship in mind. So pediatricians don't administer shots, not because they're too well paid, but because they don't want children to equate doctor with pain, because they want the doctor to be seen as someone that a child can trust. And that trust is not being established with a younger generation who has never seen their doctor's face in their whole entire lives, or doesn't remember their doctor's face. And so me in 2023, I was afraid of feeling like a Karen, emailing my pediatrician to say, like, maybe y'all should drop the mask mandate. I don't know. I'm just saying, I think it would be nice. I still wrote that email way too nicely. And I kind of felt like I had to, because I'm selling this book about how we need to fight. But even parents like us are still kind of like, ooh, squeamish, but we need to get over that squeamishness for the sake of our children.
Yeah. I tell a story in the book about, so, we don't want our kids to be child soldiers in the leftist fights, but when my middle son was in first grade, they had the climate march, the Greta-led climate march. And he had just transferred to the school after school had already begun a few weeks in. So I didn't want him to be different. I didn't want him to be targeted. I didn't want to start with the teacher. So I let him march in this climate march. And he had a sign that said, Earth dies, we die. And I had to go over it at home where, like, the Earth is not going to die and we might die, but the Earth will be here and it'll be ticking along. And I had to point out that all these climate activists who push this idea are living on their private yachts and flying in their private planes and having their giant houses. So don't worry about it. And also, you're in first grade and you should not be fighting this fight. So we're not perfect, and we're not expecting other parents to be perfect, but we all need to put up a fight, and we need to start now.
Yeah, I want to bring up sort of, you reference it in the book, but it was like a major dust up sort of in the conservative pundit world a few years ago, the argument about drag queen story hours between Sohrab Ahmari and David French. I think we all know both of them. That argument was sort of one thing a few years ago. It's become very different now.
Yep.
Why is it so important? Why was it so prescient?
So I think that argument went off the rails. Oh, I just woke up my own baby. I'll let Karol take the rest of this answer. Sorry.
Well, it's funny because it was very prescient, and the moment was where does freedom of speech matter more than what's happening to children? I think that at the time I was sort of evenly divided between the two of them, maybe even leaning David French, and now I'm all the way on Sohrab Ahmari's side.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
Yeah, I think a lot of people do.
It was very radicalizing.
But it's because they targeted the kids. I don't mind. I always enjoyed drag queens, and I don't care what adults do. I used to go to drag shows. I grew up in New York City. Listen, and in fact, there was whatever. I'm not going to get into that. But yes, the drag queen thing, I don't care what adults do, but children are a completely different thing. And it was like also one thing that some random library did a drag queen story hour, but then it became everywhere. And it became like, if you didn't want your kids going to drag queen story hour, you're a bigot. It grew and ballooned almost exactly how Sohrab said it would. And he was right. And, it turns out that we should have been fighting that from the start.
Yeah. Let me speak also about, the label groomer. That is considered on the left to be the ultimate smear that right-wing racist bigots throw at educators. Sort of trying, they claim it's a lie that, to compare what goes on in education about sex and, sort of gender ideology and sort of the idea of grooming, the way, a sexual predator grooms children. Is that a fair label? It's
yes.
used in the book. Explain
yes.
to me why it's fair.
The worst thing about writing a book is that you write something and it doesn't see print right away. I wrote that chapter well before we started throwing around that word groomer. And that's exactly what it is. We're teaching children that they can keep secrets from their children or from their parents, and that they should, about sexuality.
I would just add to that I don't call people groomers because I made this vow a few years ago not to call people names. And let me tell you, I struggle with that vow every single day because a lot of people need to be told how dumb they are. But I don't do it because I've made this pledge not to insult people like that. But I understand the impulse. And the left is really quite brazen about their name calling for the right. If you have any questions about anything, they have a name for you. And so let me not feel too sorry for the left being targeted by being called groomers, since they surely know how to dish it. They should be able to take it.
But the problem is, I don't call people a groomer. I don't throw that as an insult, but what they are doing is grooming. And the way that they're sort of offsetting any complaints about it is by doing what they did with the Don't Say Gay. And they turn it into, well, this is just an insult. This is an epithet. This is homophobia. And it's not. This is a very legitimate concern that parents have, that their children are being told to keep secrets about sexual matters from their parents by other people in authority. And I write in the book, this is the definition of grooming. And this is the definition of grooming. What you are doing is grooming. And they want to pretend that we're using it as an insult, but it is the reality.
Yeah. Karol, you write about the way children are being trained to be child soldiers for left-wing activism. Where, as a parent, as somebody who cares about society, do you draw the line between educating children about current events and issues and the kind of political indoctrination that has become really so prevalent. And the earth, the environmentalist march that your first grader was being dragged into.
Well, it's easy in that way to say that any protest, any letter writing campaign, anything that goes beyond the scope of education is not acceptable to me anymore. And I don't think should be acceptable to any parent. While we lived in Brooklyn, kids marched against, guns. They marched against hate after the 2016 election, vague hate. And I had a friend that every time she saw "no place for hate" signs, she would think to herself, except Donald Trump supporters. And they turn these kids into activists. They teach them how to do it. They get them a bullhorn. They have sit-ins. These are things that actually happen. And it is entirely unacceptable. So when people are like, but what's the big deal? So they march, for climate. We all want the climate to, be saved. Okay, well, we all want children not to be aborted, right? I mean, isn't that the goal of everybody, right? So let's have a pro-life march for the kids. Let's teach them about that. No, that would not be acceptable. And that's how you know that it's not about, kids should speak up for themselves. They should speak up for themselves, but having them put on a protest, having them do an adult activity as children is not about voicing their concerns. It's about voicing very, very specific concerns. It's about voicing only leftist concerns. And, we just can't let them use our kids in that way.
Yeah, I think that goes to the way the teaching profession, the educational establishment and its enablers are basically, they are the soldiers in, this sort of leftist political war. The American Federation of Teachers and Randy Weingarten, who is sort of, a clear, a culprit in what happened with the closing of schools. How did that happen that all of a sudden, teaching and education became the bailiwick, the preserve of the hard left?
I think for one thing, the right let it happen. They weren't pushing their values in schools. Going back to the Sorab and David French example, I think a few years ago, most of us would have believed that schools are not meant to push values at all, right? They should be, value neutral. But that didn't work. The left inserted their values into these school systems and pushed out anything that didn't belong. An example that I often give is my kids were, I realized one day while we were living in Brooklyn that my kids didn't know the Pledge of Allegiance. And I was like, wait, when does that start in schools? And so I looked it up. And of course, they were supposed to be saying it every day. It was New York state law, but they hadn't been. And I wrote to the school and I said, hi, I'd like my kids to say the Pledge of Allegiance. And this is a cheesy but true story. The Pledge of Allegiance was the very first English that I knew. It was on Romper Room, and I memorized all the words before ever knowing what any of them meant. So it mattered to me, and being able to say it with my classmates mattered to me. I wrote to the school. They said, look, we have a lot of kids from all different cultures. We don't want to insult anybody. That is a classic example of how the left inserts themselves into schools, pushes out things like patriotism because they don't want to insult anybody, and forces their ideology on your children. Meanwhile, I wrote back and I said, look, I'm an immigrant. My husband's an immigrant. We want our kids saying the pledge, and P.S., it's New York state law. They re-implemented it, but only once a week, which is not what the law says. But, a small win is a win in Brooklyn.
Right. Each of you have supplied a conclusion to your book about how parents can fight back about what's happening. Bethany, you provide an answer based on homeschooling and, as you describe it, essentially pulling your kids out of mainstream culture to save them. Karol, you speak of how to do so by fighting from within the system. Can each of you give us a thumbnail guide for parents on how and why they can resist the wokesters?
So I'll start because I currently have a quiet child. I basically argue that we should take our ball and go home, that we do not need them and they don't want us there. And so I'm not going to go somewhere I'm not wanted. And, the school down the street from me, literally down the street, only 3% of children in my daughter's grade are doing math on grade level. And that's not a school I want her in, even outside of my ideological concerns about indoctrination, which are myriad. My DMs are like a Dropbox for anyone in Montgomery County who sees something troubling in the public school system, and there's a lot. So I argue that children are best served out of the school systems, especially in these left-wing areas like I live in, for ideological reasons and just achievement. One of my favorite things that Karol says that I'm shocked that she went this entire podcast without saying is every minute that you spend on woke indoctrination is a minute you're not spending on math and reading. And that is definitely true. So we have a massive home library of books that are used. And so, I don't care about Roald Dahl in my personal house because we already own those books, and we are not consumers of modern scholastic output. The transgender book written for 10-year-olds is not really a concern of ours because we don't really go to the library anymore. And we have a massive
I might
library.
add that there's a story in your book about your daughter taking a book out of the library about for small children about a lesbian affair.
Yeah. She took out a graphic novel about soccer players, and within that book, there's a scene there's a lesbian scene between two of the girls at a sleepover, and I don't want the idea of a sexual encounter at a sleepover being introduced to my 8-year-old. I don't care what kind of sexual encounter it is. So that is how I argue that parents should handle this, is by reading classic books, old editions. We have shown our kids Richie Rich, and that's one of their favorite movies. We've been going through the entire canon of Robin Williams. So Hook and Mrs. Doubtfire, you name the Robin Williams movie made for kids, and my kids love it. They're very devastated about his death, however many years later, 13 years later, because they are growing up watching the movies that I grew up on. And I know that they're safe and I don't have to pre-watch them. A lot of parents are daunted by the task of pre-reading and pre-watching. I am not interested in reading any more middle grade books than I have to. And I do it with my kids for school, but I know that I can put Nancy Drew in front of them and they're fine. There's a book series that my kids have been going through that was written in the 1950s called Freddie the Frog. I know there's no gender ideology in Freddie the Frog, so load it up on your Kindle and have at it. And that's how we've decided. We've just basically sort of turned back the clock in our house, and all of the media is 10 years ago or more, and the books are even older, and we homeschool. And I think that's the way to do it, because in this modern culture, whenever we've tried to wade into it, like at that library trip where I said, sure, you can have that graphic novel about girls soccer players, it's blown up in my face. And I fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And that's how I feel about any time we turn on a movie, we turn on a book, I let them have a book, it always ends up biting me. And this has happened a lot with series that they've been reading. And so if they've been reading Wings of Fire graphic novels, which they have been, the first 5 books were fine, and they're still coming out with the books. And then on the 7th book in the series, they throw it in there. And I'm like, ugh. And my kids know that there's another book coming out. And then I'm the bad guy who has to say, no, you can't have the 7th book in the series that you've been reading for the last 6 months. And, I just hope they forget about Wings of Fire. True story. Just hope they forget about it.
So Karol, tell us about fighting from within.
We do have different paths. Bethany and I have 9 children between us, although she brings up, she brings the heft with 6. So, but we've taken different roads, and we understand that not all parents are the same. And so for me, my kids, I have 2 sons in public school and a daughter in private. And we've decided that we're not going to pre-watch everything, but we're going to have open conversations about the fact that they are targeting you and they are trying to indoctrinate you, and you should be aware. And my kids have become very woke police because of that. They now come home and they tell me things that they heard, and they're like, is this something? Is this something? They know that masking, for example, was ridiculous early on. I asked them not to have fights about it at school. My middle son did not manage that. He had plenty of arguments. And it's the way that we keep them safe is by giving them the information and letting them use that information, because I'm not going to be there, at every step along the way. When they're going to go to college and, all these books again that tell you how woke kids get in college, I want them to be protected from that before they get there. I want them to know that this isn't starting then. And I want them to understand how to address it in their own lives. One thing that Bethany and I do agree on very strongly is raising resilient kids is the goal here. You want them to be able to survive the onslaught, whatever that onslaught may be, as they get older. And for us also, pulling them out of society, obviously, and I know Bethany and I agree on this also, it's difficult in a lot of other ways, like the pediatrician's office. You just can't, the pediatrician still got a woke education at medical school. So now you're dealing with them in their office. And I love our pediatrician, so I shouldn't even say that about her, but the office is still masking. And so we have these paths that we tell parents they can take, and it's not going to be the same solutions for everybody, but the overall message is to fight back against this. And whether you're going to take the route of exiting your kids from society or participating in it and teaching them, what they should be doing along the way, fighting is the message here. You have to fight back.
Yeah, I think that's so true. It applies, the courage to fight back is at the core of, all of our, principles of whether we can actually survive as a democracy in the face of this, sort of woke Marxist assault on Western civ. Bethany and Karol, thanks so much for coming on today. We barely scratched the surface of this great book, and thank you for your important work on these issues. Good luck with the book. It's a must-read for parents and for really everybody else who cares about the future of this country. It'll scare you, but it'll also inspire you.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for coming on. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition, whether you're listening to us on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, or on JBS TV. Please like and or subscribe to Top Story. Click on the bell for notifications. Give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org. Let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.